My name is Raida Mirza. I'm a neurogeneticist from Seattle Children's Hospital. Just to give you a very, two-sentence kind of overview of my research, I'm a neurogeneticist. As I mentioned, I study kids with developmental brain disorders such as autism, epilepsy, large head sizes, and brain malformations. And the focus of my work is studying or understanding the genetic causes and the natural history and clinical features of these disorders.
My name is Richard Hunkinen, and I'm a biochemist at the University of South Alabama in the College of Medicine. And we have been studying protein phosphatases for 25 years. And so the focus of my lab is developing small molecule regulators of activity, inhibitors, and activators.
Hi, I'm David Beck. I'm a clinical genetics fellow, and I previously worked with Wendy Chung at Columbia. I have an interest in neurodevelopmental diseases and kind of understanding their mechanism, and I've been working with Wendy with a couple of different projects.
Hello, I'm Megan Cho. I'm a genetic counselor, and I also worked with Wendy at Columbia clinically, and now I work at a lab called GeneDx, which is actually right around the corner here in Gaithersburg, and it's a genetic testing laboratory, so some of the tests of your children might have been done there. And we worked with Wendy when we were first discovering this gene and publishing that. And so I head the research department there in efforts like this where we try to get new gene discoveries out there, and so families can make use of that information.
And I'm Wendy Chung. I'm a medical geneticist at Columbia, as you've heard. And I also have the pleasure of working with Jennifer Cherniagel and Lizney Kartner, who's outside on the Simon's VIP project. Now for your question.
Okay, thank you. My name is Greg Butler, and first of all, I just want to thank you all for being here and taking your time to be here with us. Earlier in your presentation, Dr. Chung, you were talking about the gene therapy and how long it might take and all that. And then towards the end of the presentation, you mentioned you had a kind of a diagram up there with various things that would happen or might happen. And you mentioned flipping the switch. And I didn't know if gene therapy is different than what you were talking about when you mentioned flipping the switch. And in addition to that, I believe Richard was talking last night about creating a compound that might help. So I'm not sure if the compound and the flipping the switch and the gene therapy are all the same thing, or are they different?
Yeah, so I'll let Richard chime in with what he was talking about. I'm sorry I missed that last night, Richard. But so I think the idea is whether it's flipping the switch from a gene therapy point of view or a gene editing point of view or supplying a medication. I think the question that at least I have is that I would anticipate that correcting the underlying problem or helping to correct the problem would help for future problems. The question is, how much can it help with things that have gone on in the past as well? That's kind of fundamentally the question that at least I'm asking. And so I think it probably can do at least the future things, and depending on how long the condition has been in the brain, I think the open question is how much we can catch up, how much we can make up for lost time.
Yeah. And that holds true. I mean, ideally, you'd want to go in and fix the gene. I mean, that's I think, the perfect strategy if it can be done. In the interim, so the idea is if you have a mutation, it's causing a physical change in the protein itself. And the first thing we need to understand is, what is that physical change? How is this mutation causing a different fold? And then how does that change the biological activity of that protein? And then if you want to develop a cure, ultimately, from a small molecule point of view, you develop a compound that would revert that change. So if you've got something that's sitting like this and it's pushed like this because of the mutation, or it's bigger, in this case we have negative charges and positive charges that are you're swapping a negative for a positive. And so the idea was, could you make something that would mimic the normal, something that would fit in and either push this residue out of the way or push it in the correct direction? But what we have to figure out first is, what is actually going wrong? And we're at the infancy of this. We don't even know the biology. What does R5D do in a signaling mechanism? So we have a lot to understand about what is normally going on. And then the other fix that you can do is if the pathway is known, often they're redundant and sideways pathways. If you have one clog, there's another pathway that the cell can take to get around that. And so you might, even though you can't fix this, can you induce another sideways parallel pathway to become more active or less active to get the downstream event corrected or modulated? But first we have to understand what are these events, and we're really at a very early stage in understanding that.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Gina Grant. I'm from Ireland. My son, when he was 3, was diagnosed with the mitochondrial disease complex 2 and low and 3 from a muscle biopsy. But since then, on retesting, it's come back normal. So what the doctors and us were thinking was that this gene maybe talked to the mitochondrial wrong or caused it to react in a certain way. Could this be possible, or why was he diagnosed with mitochondrial disease?
Yeah. Yes, that's very possible. So one of the things that we're interested in, and a lot of people are interested in, is what controls basic metabolism. So the job of the mitochondria is basically to produce ATP, or energy, for the cell. And there are lots of complex mechanisms that feed into making sure that every cell has just the right amount of ATP. And then when you have extra, you'll basically turn on mechanisms to store it as fat. So there is evidence that the PP2 family has a major role in metabolic regulation, and that would feed into the mitochondria in that way. Well, yeah, so everything's regulated. So the idea is what you want to do is when you need energy as a cell, you need to generate ATP. And when you have a surplus of energy, then you want to take your surplus and use the ATP to generate fat for storage that you can then later mobilize to generate the ATP to keep your cells alive. And so every cell, you only have about, depending on who you listen to, 10 seconds to a couple minutes worth of ATP reserves in an individual cell. And so you constantly have to regenerate that. So a lot of our biochemistry is just keeping your cells alive, taking the food, breaking it down, generating that ATP, taking the surplus when you have it, turning it into fat for storage or glycogen for short-term storage, and then mobilizing the glycogen and the fat when you actually need the ATP for energy. And that's all going on behind the scenes. You don't think store energy, use energy. That's all basic biochemical reactions that are happening in your cells.
So theoretically, when he was diagnosed with mitochondrial disease, that was correct, but it wasn't a genetic form of mitochondrial disease. It was because the mutation spoke to the mitochondria incorrectly, or...
Yeah.
And now he doesn't have mitochondria, but it could affect his mitochondria again.
Yeah, so if you have a signal that's telling the mitochondria, the mitochondria is basically going to make ATP all the time when it has oxygen present. But if you become anoxic, if you have low oxygen levels, then you want to turn to another pathway we call glycolysis so that you can generate ATP short terms during periods of low oxygen. So there's all kinds of regulations, and these phosphatases you can think of as kind of on-off switches. So you put the phosphate on, and that can turn a process on or it can turn it off. And we have kinases that put the phosphate on, but it wouldn't go anywhere. If a cell had a kinase but no phosphatase, it would modify the protein, and then the cell would have no choice but either to degrade that protein and resynthesize it so it could be rephosphorylated, or the phosphatases evolved so that we could take that phosphate off and you could recycle. So instead of taking the protein, breaking it down, resynthesizing it, you can simply put the phosphate on, turn the thing on, take the phosphate off, turn it off. So these are signaling switches, and we use those to control the activity of enzymes in cells. And we have these complex cascades that feed onto one another.
Let me suggest this. So what we're going to try and do is keep questions to things that are going to be useful for the whole group. It's okay. It's great to hear the discussion. What I'm just going to say, and my fellow geneticists may or may not agree with me, and that's okay. I think previously we made several diagnoses of what we thought were mitochondrial disorders based on what we knew to be best information at the time, that I think since then we have realized were really not mitochondrial disorders. So what I'm going to suggest that you do is take one or all of us as geneticists, Dr. Merzog, Dr. Beck, and or myself, especially if you have those records about the mitochondrial testing that was done. We'll be glad to go into that deeply. I have to be honest, I just don't know. Until we see more data specifically about your child, I think we should just reserve judgment in terms of what that testing really meant.
Because I know the question of mitochondrial disorders came up yesterday during the panel from several families about a similar observation about abnormalities of the muscle on the muscle biopsy. I think what's helpful, like Dr. Chung mentioned, is really getting an exact description of what those are. And it also comes back to the point of seeing exactly what the genetic testing that was done, because the diagnosis of these disorders is very challenging. And most of you guys have had a very comprehensive genetic test looking at a lot of genetic etiologies that may or may not include mitochondrial disorders. So we're happy to look into the details of those with you and walk through with you those findings, because they can be quite complex and challenging.
Last night, Dr. Richard, you had mentioned showing us the location and the variants and how that works. I need the diagram. Will you do it?
Yeah. Yeah, I will put together a diagram. So the idea is that the phosphatase is a 3-protein complex. There's what we call a catalytic subunit, which is C, and then there's a regulatory targeting subunit, which is the B, and then the A is kind of a scaffold. So the A holds the catalytic and the B subunit. So if you talk about the PP2, the catalytic subunit, we call PPP2, it's actually now AC, it used to be CA, so it gets really confusing. But there's 2 different genes encoding the catalytic subunits. There are actually 2 different genes encoding the scaffolds, and the R1A that she showed is one of those scaffolds. And then there are 18 different B subunits, and R5D is one of those. And so that forms a holoenzyme, and so you have 74 different PP2 holoenzymes that function in the cell to dephosphorate different things. And so the B subunit takes it to a specific place. And here, this one's highly expressed in brain. And then if you look at that interaction, the B subunit interacts with the C. There's a loop that fits very close to the catalytic site. And the hotspot of mutations are all on that loop. And we think that loop is feeding the substrate to the protein. So the B takes it where it needs to go and then helps the interaction of what it's supposed to do. And from a biochemical perspective, it's very interesting because they're all on a loop, and you can put each mutation in there, and that will change how this loop interacts with the C. And so that's what we've got to figure out, is what is going on. Is this an inhibitory mutation? Is it an activating mutation? Does it make it do its job better? Does it make it do its job worse? And then once we understand what it's doing, we can then try to figure out how to fix that. So yeah, what I'll do is I'll have to put a diagram, and we have the crystal structure of the 5C, which is that domain is exactly the same. And we can put each amino acid on there and maybe make a picture and I'll figure out how to get it on Facebook.
Hello, my name's Pritesh. Actually, I'm a clinical oncologist. I don't really understand anything you're saying, but I do have some background in cancer. One of the things I've heard about is something called genomic instability. So a mutation in one gene giving rise to the potential for more mutations. In the case with our children, is it possible? And if so, should we all be trying to get whole exome sequencing? Because Juhi was diagnosed based on a limited subset of genes.
I'll I'll try and rephrase the question, and you'll see if I got it right or not. So the question is, with this particular phosphatase, does it lead to, the term was genomic instability, which the way I think of it from an oncology point of view is, are there other mutations that then come about later that can either lead to other problems? And then the question is, what's the right testing? Should it be something that included sort of this amount of the genetic information, or should we be looking and being very all-inclusive because there might be some other genetic mutations we need to pay attention to? Is that kind of the spirit of it? Okay, so the first, and certainly everyone else should chime in, I don't think of this as being primarily one of those genes that has to do with DNA repair, mismatch repair, sort of genomic instability like we oftentimes think of with cancer. Richard can...
Yeah, I would agree with
right.
that.
So I don't think this is going to be that type of thing that we have to worry about either continuing to look at it over time because the genome is changing. And I do think that depending on what the mutation is, I guess I would answer that question differently. So for the families that have the 198 mutation, I'm pretty convinced, and we'll be seeing those of us, Dr. Merzak, Dr. Beck, myself will be seeing many of your kids today. The 198s, I think you're probably in the right club and it's the right answer. I think we are still trying to evaluate some of the less common ones to see whether or not it feels like the right fit, and I'm sure you're doing the same in terms of comparing notes with the families at this point. My guess is the majority of you, as Richard was saying, because it's all in the same portion of the phosphatase, that I'm feeling like they're probably very similar if we feel that clinically the overlap is very, very much the same. I still don't know whether we will end this weekend saying 100% of this is right, or maybe the answer is 95%. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think that's exactly like you mentioned, Wendy. I think we'll have to see. I think the jury's still out for this. This would be a very interesting and important, one of the very important outcomes we could come up with out of this meeting. In terms of the question regarding, cancer, I think risk and everything, if you don't mind, I'd like to take a step back for 1 second from that to share with you some of my experience with another gene that was actually in it's kind of a related pathway that actually is a cancer gene. So we have studied for many years a gene called PIK3CA. PIK3CA is within this pathway called the AKT pathway that maybe some of you who've been kind of Googling a lot the function of the PP family of enzymes might have come across, because it kind of interacts, but in a peripheral way, in a way. And we have seen mutations of PIK3CA, it causes a bit of a similar clinical picture. In a way, it causes kids to have developmental delays, autistic features. Some of them have a large head size. And that gene is actually, mutations of that gene are actually seen in adults separately with cancer. And the biggest question that most of the families had, and rightly so, was, well, does that mean that my kid would have, a risk for cancer? And while we still don't know the answer, but there is that interesting phenomena where sometimes you can have mutations of the same gene cause a different set of developmental problems, but then in adults cause something else, and sometimes there's no overlap between them. So it's very interesting. PIK3CA for you, I'm sure you'd know, it's considered a driver gene, meaning that it would drive actually the formation of other mutations and instability in a way, but we haven't seen any evidence of that in kids. And so it's a really important question, but I think that it's hard to make sweeping judgments right off the bat at this very early stage for any family of genes, let alone this very complicated phosphatase family of genes.
I have a sort of related question. The question is, are there any theories so far as to the primary source of the development delay? The context is within treatment, so if my understanding is right, in our kids, their larger head sizes are primarily due to either larger neurons or more neurons than a typical kid has. So the question is that the primary source of development delays, or is it still a dysfunctional pathway which is causing it, or perhaps some combination of both? Because if it is structural, then I assume any treatment isn't going to shrink the head, right? So it has to be some alternate type of mechanism to interfere with it. So are there any theories around this so far?
Yeah, I would say from a very basic point of view, the problem is we don't even understand the full normal biological role of the R5D. And so it's hard to predict how a defect will change a role that we don't even understand yet. So that's kind of the key. I mean, the question to me, the very basic question is, do these mutations inhibit the activity of the holoenzyme, or are they actually modifying it or making it, in some case, you could argue it's possibly it makes it have a different function or a superior dephosphorylation of a certain subset of the normal substrates. So we really have to figure out what is going on normally, and then how does this change? And so the beauty of that is the technology is here to take cells that are normal and then mutate them and then look for the differences. But if it happened, I mean, that's the whole question. Did it happen early in development, in which case there may not be a recovery? Or is it a metabolic thing, in which case there'd be substantial recovery? We just don't know.
And I'll just chime in. We clearly don't know, but I don't think it's that it's solely a structural difference. In other words, I do think there are things that happen developmentally, but I think from a functional day-to-day aspect of how those cells are working, I do think it's continuing to have ongoing differences in the signaling, well, the way those cells are working. And that's, as I think Richard was saying, it's here, but then it cascades in terms of having an effect on many other things within the cell that continue to be a challenge.
And one other thing is that cells can compensate with time. So a lot of these pathways are not linear. They have branch points and convergent points. So if something goes wrong, then as cells develop, they try to do workarounds. And so you don't necessarily have to fix the mutation if you can understand the other pathways that are slowing down or speeding up the endpoint. Then you can say, okay, these are other things you could also target to try to get the biological activity restored. And maybe you can't do it 100%, but you might get it back to 80% or 50%.
It's with me. It's a bit difficult. I that have questions all the time. It's a bit difficult at this stage. I've been sitting here 10 minutes ago and I'm thinking, okay, what are we going to ask you guys? Hardly any of us understand chemistry to the level that you guys understand it. I've just heard Dr. Mirza say that there are adults that have some genetic effects, some genetics signs, and actually do not affect them the same way you see the effects in children that carry the same. But I'm thinking, oh, hold on a second, I thought we were born with a genetic pole that doesn't change. So how come you're seeing an adult with genetic change and a child with genetic change with completely two different reactions?
Yeah. So sorry, I don't mean to. Sorry if it was a little confusing. So what I meant to say by that is that because of this question of this link to cancer, for some of these really fundamental cellular genes that have important functions, the same definitely this is the case for PPP2R5D. Is that all the children who have been affected, it was a genetic change that occurred early on in development. Like Dr. Chung mentioned early on, it happened at one of the earliest stages of development. But again, stepping back from that, in terms of what does that mean? Could other genetic mutations occur in our lifetime? If we take again step back from PPP2R5D and just talk about genetic, all of us, as adults, throughout our lifetime, we can all acquire mutations, as we grow. Yeah, I mean, that's the most common, one of the more common mechanisms, unfortunately, for cancer, right, is that we can all acquire mutations as we age, right? So this is a phenomena that can happen. In pediatric disorders caused by, growth pathways, abnormalities of growth pathways, there is that phenomena where sometimes you can have a genetic defect early on in development that causes delays and causes, behavioral challenges. But in adults, separately, as we age, some of us can get mutations of those same pathways that would cause an isolated tumor somewhere, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so far, there's no evidence that there's a lot of overlap, meaning that a child who's born with a mutation in these pathways, if they grow and when they're older, do they get cancer? We don't know that yet. So that's part of the research that we're doing, is actually tracking kids as long as possible to actually see if that's their risk. Does that help clarify a little bit what
it was news to me.
Yeah.
And I don't know about others. I just really didn't understand it. I didn't see it this way. I thought we were born with our genetic poll, and this is what we run with. So ignorance, I'm sorry, excuse me. But
No,
I've
not
learned
at all,
something
not
new.
at all. And not everybody is aware, I think, of this, and it's not always a reassuring, kind of feature to say,
No, it's
oh,
not.
well, I could get a mutation at some point in my life, but it is true, unfortunately.
It seems to me that at this early stage, we don't really know much about how the gene operates, and I understand that we are very, very much at the beginning, and obviously we are here because you need the samples, so we can get to understand it better. Are we going to come out of this conference and at some point in the near future, are you guys going to put together a clear definition of that syndrome? Is it a syndrome? Are we going to call it a syndrome? It's very difficult when you guys know, because you speak to a lot of us. I don't know, I might go to an ENT doctor and tell them, yeah, you heard it from all of us. PPP what? And it just, is it possible you have a chance to see all of our children at this couple of days. Are we going to come out at least with a clear definition of what we know for sure? Yeah, there might be variations on it, but a core definition that says this is PPP2R5D, or whichever way you want to call it.
So to me, I think there are two questions embedded in here, and I'm curious about what you families think about this. So one of it is just that PPP2R5D is a mouthful, right? And so I think some of the things I've heard from people is we should name it something that we can get our heads around and rolls off the tongue. And I think that's something that we should talk about. Anyway, different people have different thoughts about this, so we should talk about that. I think there's a other question that you're also asking, which are what are the core features of this condition? And that was part of what I tried to do on the slide deck that I put together, is say that these are the things and here's the frequency with which we see them. And so what are those core features? And I definitely think we are starting to see convergence. I think what we're hoping to do is based on whether it's the one-on-one sessions that we have set up with you and or others, to be able to now get a really good sense in a very concentrated way of what are those core features and who can we say should be defined to be within that syndrome. So, and I think all of us would like to be able to get the word out to the community with what that consensus is. So what I mean by that is being able to say, not just on the Facebook page, but where medical professionals will see this, what are those core features?
Thank you for that. And one last thing before I forget. We all come from different countries, from different medical systems. I know we're in a very early stage, but I don't want for my son, for us to get to a stage where we're very involved with Jordan's Guardian Angel, with the beautiful research, and then because of some sort of elusive English law or European law, I am prevented from taking my son bring my son here or treatment to come to him. How are you guys? I have no idea who to ask this question to. It's very early stages, but I'm assuming research will entail few steps along the way. How do we overcome such, geographical and political, governmental barriers, legal barriers, if there are any? Maybe there is nothing, I don't know. But I don't know how to think about it.
So to me, there are a couple things within that. Number one is the world is getting to be a smaller place, which I think is a very good thing, right? So I think in terms of what we're doing from an ownership point of view, from a governance point of view, is we are not taking any barriers in terms of any geopolitical anything, right? So as far as I'm concerned, if the families themselves have contributed anything, whether it's information or cells or whatever, that's freely available. I think the governance that we've said, at least in terms of what Jordan's Guardian Angels is funding, is that information that comes from that, from any of the investigators that might get funding, again, that information, whatever resources are created from that, are shareable internationally in terms of anyone who does that. There is one tricky thing which you allude to, that's let's hope that 5 years from now we come together and it's time for a clinical trial, that there is medication or gene therapy or something. That does get to be more complicated because there are specific regulations, whether it's EU regulations or whatever it is, that will say that you have to do things for registration that are for the safety of that particular group of citizens. let's make sure we get to that place first. That's what I think we need to commit ourselves to do. After that, I think there are issues with that, and I'll also be very frank, which is that assuming that there is something that's efficacious, it's also about access to that in terms of the cost of that. Certain governments, in a good way, ensure that there is access for all the citizens within their countries. In the United States, I think we are less good at that. But I think we are committed as a scientific medical community that we develop something, that it's safe, it's efficacious, and that it's accessible to anyone that does that. I think what Jordan's Guardian Angels, and Joe, you certainly can chime in, is trying to make sure that you all are protected in terms of that it is something that whatever governance that there is allows for making sure that everyone's going to have access to any treatment that might be developed.
So I could comment just briefly on that question because I know it's one that several families have asked me. We have a team of lawyers, and I'm looking for Dennis, and I'm not sure I see him in the room right now, but he and his law firm, we have a whole team of lawyers that are looking specifically on this issue. Right now we're involved in protecting the intellectual property that results from these efforts and from these brilliant people here so that the foundation will retain those intellectual property rights. The goal of that is when we are ready, and I'll say when we're ready to do human clinical trials with a therapeutic treatment, that we will be in a position to own the intellectual property rights so that we can assure as the therapy or the therapeutic treatment is developed and commercialized that it will be available to everybody in the world. As Wendy said, all of this information is going to be available to everybody in the world. Wendy and team will make a decision at the right time where the clinical trials will occur. There are advantages, and we're doing an analysis of that right now, of Europe versus US, probably US, although the rules are a little more strict. But in any way, we will make sure as we do this that it's available to all the children in the world, and in fact, our goal here is to provide all the results of this research to everybody.
What I was asking, essentially, the heart of the question is, coming from England, for example, I'm sure all of you heard about Charlie, the baby,
Charlie,
you know the story. That's just, it's not a small, it's a huge life, but I'm asking, is there a possibility that if I choose, if at all it's my choice, to enroll my son into clinical trials, that the British government or the doctors in the UK, in our case it's the UK, are they able to prevent us from taking part in it? And that's what I don't know. Do your lawyers know if there are any limitations? Can they prevent our children from joining the research actively if and when it gets to this stage, like we all hope?
So we've got to walk before we can run. But if we get to that point, I certainly have had patients from parts of the world where the medication was not available. I've had patients come from, whether it's from Europe in some cases, from Asia, for other things where we had either clinical trials or FDA-approved medications would come over from there. I've had in the same way, I guess I shouldn't, anyway, I have known of patients to get medications that were approved in other countries and get them through back channels in the United States where it wasn't FDA approved. So if we get to that point, I think there are ways of being able to deal with this. I think the important thing is we need to get to that point first. Number two is that all families have to be able to understand what the benefits and potential risks are and then make an informed decision about whether or not they want to do that. And then I think we, as your advocates on the medical and scientific side, are going to do everything we can to get a treatment as fast as possible, as safely as possible, to as many people as possible, and to work in whatever creative way we have to do to make that happen.
Can I just say one thing about your earlier point with the end goal clinically for today or in the short term? As Dr. Chung said, I think we want to get a better idea of tabulations or how many people have what features and figure out molecularly, once we do some studies on the blood, make sure everyone's in the same club, like she said. But another example to think about is like other genetic conditions that you might have heard of. Like this one is rare and random and your ENT is not going to know what it is. But something like Down syndrome, for example, which is totally separate, not this. But even when we look at a common condition like that, we see out of many, many thousands of children who have that, maybe a certain percentage do have a heart defect and a certain percentage doesn't. So even once we get a good number of people with this and we get the list, we might not still be able to say like exactly what this particular syndrome is, just because there's always going to be that variability. But that's what we need to try to do in terms of treatment and things like that down the line.
Dr. Chung, you talked a little bit about growing the size of this club, right? And if you've been on our Facebook page, there's this geographic map that Larry put together with dots for everybody, right? And it's quite clear that I think we have one from South America, a lot from Europe, from Australia, New Zealand, and North America. Nothing from the Middle East, nothing from Asia, which is 1/3 of the global population. What in your opinion is resulting in that? Is it lack of genetic testing access? Is it that is not done at all? Or is it just something else? And what can we do to influence that? I'm sure you think about this on a daily basis. Not daily basis, but in all your involvement.
So I do think about this on a daily basis. So I think it's about, this is still not inexpensive to be able to do the type of testing. As someone was pointing out earlier, the testing that we're doing is not usually specific and only for PPP2R5D. It's actually globally looking at really the entirety of the genetic information to figure out what the answer is. Either it's PPP or it's something else. So that is not inexpensive. The good news from my point of view is that the cost of doing that analysis, that is generating the sequence data and analyzing it, the cost for both of those is coming down quite significantly and will continue, if my predictions to continue coming down quite significantly. But it is still a trade-off that people have to think about. Healthcare systems, governments have to make a trade-off in terms of, do they spend their dollars doing this? Do they spend their dollars on vaccinations? Do they spend their dollars on pregnant women, preventing cancer? I mean, there are all things that we have to decide in a society, both about health and even beyond health, about what to do. So I think that's what the difficulty is. And in different societies, they're just they have different economic pressures. They have different numbers of people they have to take care of, and they have to make some valued decisions. Their citizens have to make value decisions about what are priorities. So at least geopolitically, that's where I see all of this. I will say that I have actually, in a global way, I'm working, happy to advertise this, I'm working globally with parts of groups that are in India, healthcare systems that are in China, because we do know we have larger numbers there than I have in any place in the United States, at least. So I do think we're trying to do this in a very global sense, but it doesn't happen overnight. And so we need some patience. I'll say right here in the United States where we practice, I'm sad to say that I have many patients who can't get access to this testing, even though it's very robust and available in the United States and Canada. And I think many of us are working to be able to demonstrate essentially the utility of this to convince insurance companies that this is a worthwhile thing to do. But in the United States, I can say it's still far from a battle that's won.
Are you seeing a general upwards trend, though, in the amount of genetic testing going on, just worldwide?
Megan, you may know best from at least the United States. Do you think the testing volume's going up?
I mean, I think generally, yes, more people are getting this type of sequencing done, and traditionally or historically it was done through genetics offices only, and that's still probably the majority of tests that come into labs, but lots of times now maybe primary care doctors or immunologist doctors or other people are sending in tests just because they didn't know that this type of testing was available, and so it's about educating the different physicians as well. And we always see waves with insurance companies just in terms of coverage, and so things can be kind of getting better in terms of coverage and more people are getting it done, and then for some reason someone changes a policy and then everyone in Blue Cross Blue Shield suffers or Cigna suffers, and then it's just more work to try to convince them. And that's something that genetic counselors are trying to get involved with too, because we are kind of trying to make access to everyone, but if the insurance companies are putting up roadblocks, that makes it really hard. And of course, when you get into international healthcare systems, as Dr. Chung was saying, it can get even messier. Not that ours isn't incredibly messy as well. But there are a lot of other countries that are doing it. And so I think some of those countries send to international labs, and some of them are trying to do it in their own medical system. And so that's really hard to break into, in a sense, if it's just a local hospital that's doing testing and they offer a couple of genes and they're nowhere near set up. It takes a lot of work and manpower to look through all 20,000 genes. So it's still, right now, I think it's getting better, but it's still a lot of work.
And I'll chime in here quick, Sid, to tell you. I mean, I think the good news is that whether you're in the US or in Europe, there are so many robust research consortia that are really focused on increasing the availability of advanced genetic tests to people, like the SPARK effort, like Dr. Chung mentioned. In Europe, there are several large consortia that offer these advanced genetic tests free of charge to overcome the insurance and the financial coverage barriers that exist in a lot of places. I happen to have a few connections in the Middle East by virtue of my life, but and I do know that there are also these research efforts there. There's actually several really, really good research groups now within the Middle East that offer exome sequencing and genome sequencing to children with developmental disorders. And so they don't rely on the healthcare system, the local healthcare system, to provide coverage for those kids to get these tests. And they're very collaborative. So basically what that means is that we just need to talk to each other as a community, as a global community of families and researchers and scientists, and share data, basically. I think that's the biggest challenge. But I think this is easily overcome with collaboration. So I think, it was mentioned by Wendy, I think that there's going to be, for every family here, there's going to probably be 100 out there. But I think hopefully within the next few years, we'll see an increase, definitely, in the number of families coming to care from the areas that you mentioned. Yeah.
I was going to let everybody know, and I was just telling Megan, because of a couple of our children's cases actually here in the U.S., Blue Shield just did recently change their policy and open up and allow for coverage of whole exome sequencing. The criteria are fairly limited so far, but the bottom line is the door is now open, and it was part of our families here in the U.S. that did that. So if you know folks in the U.S. that want it or need that coverage, we can help facilitate it now.
Just a quick question on Spark. You were speaking about earlier that was only for those inside the US. Would there be any point in the future that would open up?
You're not the first person to ask that question. So I would love to be able to open up internationally, especially for English-speaking countries, just because there are issues with languages. At this point, I don't have the capacity to do that, but we are looking very much to be able to do that in the future, if we can, but that's a big if. So we've had the request, and I definitely hear it, and if I can, I will, but we'll have to see.
So out of curiosity, have you all come across any individuals with non-pathologic variants of the PPP2R5D mutations? And could this be a source of research for the alternate pathways that you mentioned?
So I'll say one thing about this, and people can chime in. So in a good way, as Dr. Mirzog was saying, sharing of data is very important. So they're actually, in a good way, very large aggregations now of genetic data from normal individuals. By the way, I don't think, at least I'm not normal. I don't think any of us are normal, but a bunch of us at least. And by that I mean like over 100,000 individuals. So this is for anyone who really wants to be a science geek. You can go on to Nomads and you can be able to search around and see the variation. So we do have a sense of what the normal variation within this gene is, and there is some normal variation. I have to say that I'm learning from you guys in terms of what that variation is within this gene, even within our families in this room. And I do think there's some very interesting variation that we need to understand better, a la we're just at the beginning of understanding what this is doing. So I would say that, yes, we know some of it in being normal. I fully expect that when we get the complete catalog of genetic variations, it's not going to be, you were asking about the syndrome and how we define the syndrome. I think there's going to be kind of a core features that'll explain a large portion, and then I think there's going to be some variation around the edges that in an interesting way we'll see whether or not it's related because the genetic change is associated with the variation on the theme. I think that's sort of, as we call this genotype phenotype, but does the gene predict what we're seeing clinically in that person? I don't know yet, but it's a great question.
Just chime in here quickly to tell you, and one of the key, pieces of information that I think to this audience, this is probably preaching to the choir, I think, is to really understand also what the parental data shows. Were the parents tested as well? Because I remember a few of you yesterday brought up the fact that your kids may have been diagnosed with like deletions, an extra or missing piece of DNA that was inherited from one of the parents, and that is really critical. So with identifying more variants in the gene, which undoubtedly I think will happen because more and more kids are getting exome sequenced, I think one of the key pieces of key questions we need to ask is, okay, what did the parents' results show? Because a lot of the variation could be just inherited from generation to generation and not really cause any disease, and I think that's really key. So I think that's one of usually the first questions we ask. Whenever we have a child with a new variant within a gene, which is happening now almost every day for us in our practices, we then try to test the parents as well. And not every family would have had that done, but I think that's really key to try to understand if it's related at all.
Let me just chime in for that. So for any of the families where your child has been tested, but you as parents haven't been tested, if you weren't tested because of an access issue in terms of insurance wasn't covering it or there was some other problem, the Simons VIP study will cover the cost of that testing. So if there's anyone who wants to get that information, that piece of the puzzle, we'll cover that. So don't let that be a barrier.
I have a question. I have the microphone. It's back over here. While we're waiting for the genetics and the gene mutation, the gene therapy or drug therapy to come about, what can we do in the meantime? Like if it's a brain function issue that it seems a lot of the kids have, is there supplements or a diet or certain therapies that really trigger the brain that we can get just the most out of what our guys have got in there?
So each of us, I think, are going to be learning from you to see what's been working in your individual circumstances, and at least I'm hoping that as a community we can come up with kind of best practices. But some of the general things that I would say, early is good. So being able to start with early intervention, I think everyone probably has been aggressive about doing that. I think that's a good thing. I mentioned it earlier, I think getting seizures under control if they're an issue are an important thing to be able to do. I think sleep is an important thing in terms of being able to deal with learning and having a fresh brain to be able to deal with the day. I think generally keeping strong and healthy. So from a nutritional point of view, I'm not suggesting any one supplement to do it, but I just think a good healthy body is overall an important thing to do with this. And then I think it's taking other supports for brains. And I take the technology and I really take a lot of the things in terms of what we can do to support. You don't have to, I'll just give you one example, and people that know me know this is true. I'm terrible at following directions, right? So before we had our phones and GPSs and things like that, I would have a panic attack every time I'd have to go to someplace new and drive myself there, and I'd get lost. Even though that's a real deficit for my part of the brain right about here, I can compensate for that in terms of current technology. And that's what I was talking about in terms of, for some folks that are having problems with communication, that's a supplement that you can use. But I think there are a lot of other things like that, and frankly, I think if we were to, whiteboard this and figure out in terms of who's using this, who thought it helped, who didn't think it helped. And it may be, I'm just throwing this out there, it may be that after the meeting, we come up with a list of survey questions, that we actually want to gather data from each other and figure out what's worked, what hasn't worked, what was a positive thing, what was a negative thing. We've got to essentially put our heads together and figure this out. I'm committed if the families think this is a good idea and a work product that comes out of this, maybe that's one of the things we should focus on. But I do think we need to do some near-term things while we're waiting for the science to come up with the long-term things. It's a great suggestion.
Sorry, another question from me. It's just a follow-up to that question about alternative therapies. What's considered, I guess, on the fringe, not in mainstream. An MD would likely never prescribe it, and we deal with this on a weekly basis. There's something someone heard of, some therapy. The science is maybe questionable, but as parents, we throw darts and try to figure out what sticks. and it's very easy to get pulled into a rabbit hole, spend a lot of money, thinking that something is working when it could just be, natural development of your child. But what's your position on? I hate calling it fringe and alternative because there's a bias in that definition, but it's something that hasn't been isn't pushed in hospitals and in doctor offices. What's your opinion on these therapies? Are they all fake? Are they all money-making schemes? Or do they have a specific time, place, and person they work for? Any opinions and thoughts on how to navigate the alternative therapy realm?
So I'd say number one, you can catch any of us either with the one-on-one sessions or pull us aside at a break. I don't think you can monolithically say that all alternative therapy stinks, right? I think you have to actually assess each one on their individual merits. I'm just going to throw two out that I see families think about and actually that I don't think are useful, that people spend a lot of money on, and I think actually can potentially be harmful in some cases. So number one, I don't know if you've heard about hyperbaric therapy, and my colleagues may disagree with me. I don't know. We haven't chatted about this. Hyperbaric therapy, or the idea that if you give enough oxygen, like in a really concentrated chamber, that this will, do good things. I actually think that can be just the opposite, which is that having too much oxidative stress, which is what oxygen imposes, can actually do a bad thing. And I have not seen any randomized clinical trials, any hard scientific data to show that for conditions in general, neurodevelopmental conditions, much less this, that it's helpful. So hyperbaric therapy, I would say no. The other thing, which we kind of alluded to, there are some people that are touting stem cell therapy. So the idea, and I have families that have even gone around the world to be able to get, what's thought of as a stem cell transplant. What it basically is either taking their own cells or someone else's cells and infusing them into the body, hoping that it's going to do a gene correction. I have never seen that work for this type of condition under any of the circumstance that I've seen people do this. And I'm not going to call out specific researchers that are doing this, but there are some both in the United States and abroad. And I think that is actually potentially dangerous and is definitely not medically useful. So I would just warn you, there's no scientific rationale in terms of doing that. And like I said, at some point, if we do have something where infusing cells back that are corrected works, you'll be the first to hear about it. But so far, that's not the place to go.
And actually, from a biochemical perspective, high oxygen is very damaging to cells. You produce reactive oxygen species that damages your DNA. So I would say high oxygen is not something I would do.
I think just a consideration with all alternative therapies is just how well they've been studied. And the bias of the medical profession against them is just to make sure we do no harm. So unless there's been careful studies looking at supplements, there's a chance that it'll do harm. And that's something that we would want to avoid by any chance. So I think carefully studied supplements are something to consider, but on an individual basis, we can discuss them.
Can I just throw out, I'm going to ask you guys. So has anyone used a supplement or an alternative medicine that they thought has been effectual? Tell us, do you mind sharing what's worked?
Or has been for, actually, one thing I did do with Or, which you guys will consider very controversial, when he was much younger, I did the chelation, not the intravenous one, but I've done the powder, the pills. And during this time, it was also, it's not just that, I'm sure you guys probably know about it. It's a whole regime of supplementing, heavily supplementing, in order to make sure that once you're doing chelation, the body is not deficient on the essential minerals and vitamins and the metals that the body does need, because in chelation you cleanse everything. So it has to be done quite responsibly and by an approved nutritionist for that to be done. I can tell you that up until this point, for about 3 or 4 years of his life, Or had a constant, the most disgusting green diarrhea coming out of him at all hours of the day. I think I've got somewhere even a picture of him completely covered in it from head to toe. By the time we finished with this one, at least his gut has stabilized to a great extent. He started, I'm sorry guys, a bit too detailed, but I'm sure we all live it, so forgive me. His stools became more formed, it became more normal, more regulated. It was also at around, it's a bit difficult to pinpoint, directly put the finger on improvements relating to a specific method you're using at the time, because I'm not one of these parents that will just do nutrition and then I will not do physiotherapy, or just do physiotherapy and not do, I don't know, occupational therapy. So you do everything at the same time because you're dealing with different aspects of your child's being. So this I've done for a while. Sad, in my experience, some of these nutritionists are really precious selves. Eventually I just had enough of the nutritionist, so I gave up on that. I just couldn't face meeting him again, sorry. That's one thing. But a very, very high doses of supplements like definitely probiotics, going to Sid and Carol, and there are different types of probiotics. I've recently, about 3 weeks ago, a month ago, I've realized that Tor is flying off the handle again and switched his probiotics, and the immediate effect has been really noticeable. Within a couple of days, he completely calmed down. High doses of things like zinc, B15, B12 to an extent. I'm trying to think the list that have got down in the room. Omega, funnily enough, Candice is saying omega. In all early tests with the nutritionist, it turned out that he had too much omega-3. He didn't have enough omega-6 or omega-4, I can't remember now. Omega-6, to break it down, it should be 1 to 4 in the body. So Or was actually supplemented by omega-6, and that had a good effect on him. Along this time, this is actually when Or started gathering some strength to start holding on and cruise. He was between 3 and 4 years of age. And he did start walking hands-free at 4 months, 3 months, 4 months, and it was along the nutrition thing. At the moment, in the past year, he's been on CBD oil, which had, I said it yesterday, it had an amazing calming effect on him. The thing that Adam, I think, next to you, Richard, sorry, your name?
David.
Stephen, David, sorry. I appreciate what you just said, that be very careful with what you're doing and make sure that there is enough backup in terms of research. But the problem we face as parents, and I'm saying something you guys have heard many times before, all of these supplements and supporting regimes, nobody has the money. Consider how difficult it is to put the money for research at such an importance like you guys are doing. Nobody bothers researching in detail CBD oil, though a friend of mine told me Cambridge or either Cambridge or Oxford have actually started an official trial into CBD oil, the various aspects of it, the HTC that helps with epilepsy. So something is being done, but it's very slow and it will take years and years. I do agree with your warning that a lot of these supplements that nutritionists tend to give to our children, they're really high doses. You need to be with your head on your shoulder and constantly observe your child because he can overdose on certain things. I have a question here from, from Gali and Karen. I think all of us will have that question is, as professionals, when you say to keep our children healthy, and another thing is, the gluten-free, lacto-free diets, nobody really is willing to test the children and stand behind those tests to the dot to say, yes, they are. For the allergy is one thing, it's very easy. You can read in the blood, but intolerance is nobody is able to actually test our children. So we are all going by various diets, but other parents are asking, what kind of diet would you guys recommend? What do you call a healthy diet? And please do not give us the healthy, balanced diet of a child should have 3/4 protein, 1/4 carb. We really don't know.
Sure. Thank you. My name is Cynthia Lang, so I'm Jordan's mom. Sorry, hold on. One of the things I think is super important and how Jordan has thrived is I treat her like an athlete because I'm very athletic myself. So Jordan eats fabulous food. You don't have to buy supplements. You just have to eat healthy. Her diet is so simple, and she's never been hardly sick a day in her life, and she's 11. She starts her day off with oatmeal with fresh fruit in the morning, something very simple. She's on almond milk, which is a very good thing to give your children. I think Jordan might be a little lactose intolerant. I've sort of figured that out on my own. And then every lunch and dinner, she gets a protein with a vegetable, just like we all should be eating. We don't have any weight issues in our family. I'm very health conscious, more so than most. I don't allow my daughter to eat crap. I fix her lunch for her, and I've been packing her lunch every single day since she's been going to school. She's not allowed to eat the food at the cafeteria. She has raisins as a snack. I want her to mingle with all the children, which she does. She loves going to lunch. She's a normal child in so many ways because that's the way I treat her. But eating is very key. We have never had any bowel movement problems. I mean, periodically, of course, but she is so healthy, not an ear infection, hardly a cold. The key is diet. It really, truly is diet. She sleeps well. Everything just goes really well. And I know it's difficult for people, but food is the key, the total key. My daughter doesn't have any seizures, so I don't know how people handle that. But the food is, I notice when we're on holiday and we get something different, that she changes. But to your normal day-to-day life, keeping it simple is really, really the key, in my opinion. And I have not had that many difficulties or problems with my child because she eats what I eat and vice versa. There's nothing special that I make for her, but she has to eat healthy. And vegetables and protein is the way to go. And I think any athletic person would agree. So I don't know what you guys feel, but, and then as far as like the therapies, the only thing we've ever done, and it's, to me, has been wonderful, is we do physical therapy, occupational, and speech. That's it. We've done that forever. We do 2 speech, we do 2 occupational, and 2 PT. And the PT people come to Jordan's school to help her do the physical therapy at school as to what the kids are doing. So she's been able to do some of the physical stuff that other kiddos are doing at recess. So those are the things that have just been sort of simple and nice and not complicated. Just simple and nice until obviously one day there's going to be a cure. But I think food is really, really key. And I will be the biggest advocate on food because it's important to be athletic and to live a healthy life. So I'll just say that each of us is individual, right? And so I do think as much as you can do it, if you do something in terms of whether it's a supplement or something else, this is along the lines of what Dr. Beck was saying, at the very least keep notes to yourself in terms of whether or not you think it's having an effect and what the effect is. I do agree with Cynthia in terms of what I was going to say is the same prescription that I would give for all of us in this room is what I call a heart-healthy diet. So breaking that down, it's 30% fat, 20% protein, 50% carbohydrates. The carbohydrates, basically not simple sugars, but being complex carbohydrates, things like pastas, rice, things like that. As much as you can. Do you have to go totally organic? I don't think you have to go totally organic in terms of doing things. I think the things that are at most of the grocery stores and, that all of us frequent are fine in terms of being able to do that. I do think that some kids get on certain diets for whatever reason, and if they need to have a multivitamin to be able to supplement, or if they need supplements because their diet is deficient in certain things, I think they need to balance out one way or the other, because they're either eating it in the food, or if whatever their food idiosyncrasies are, they're not getting it, then it can be in the supplements. In general, I don't think there are any supplements, though, that are a total magic bullet in terms of making all of this go away. So I think you have to have realistic expectations if you're going to try some different things. The biggest thing to do is to check with your doctor if there's anything that seems very unusual, just to make sure from a safety point of view that they agree and that they're knowledgeable in case there might be some interactions or something particularly about your child. But I think these are different things. I will say that probiotics were mentioned. So the idea is that we live with bacteria in us all the time. One of the things I will say is that if you're treated with antibiotics for whatever reason, it can change your microbiome or your microflora, and at some point it may be helpful to repopulate that in terms of being able to get those bacteria back in balance in terms of what they are. And that can be done with everything from, for instance, live culture with yogurts to probiotics that are done as supplements. But I have seen that as a time when things get disrupted, because the antibiotics that we prescribe as doctors are the disruptors in terms of that.
I'm sorry, back to me. I just want to say I completely agree with what Cynthia said. It is essential to stick with simple and healthy. The problem that a lot of us have, and my son has, he would not touch anything meat or fish. And that's the sensory problems kicking in, the textures, the way it's cooked, it's mushy enough, it's not mushy enough. That's one of the reasons for supplementing. And for a child who doesn't consume protein, specifically protein, naturally that's one of the reasons why supplementing for all is very important. I just want to make a comment about what you said. Nothing is a magic bullet. It's very important for me to say that if we don't put in the efforts day in and day out, consistently, like Cynthia said, regularly, daily, you can do one thing and you will not see the benefits in other places. So I completely agree with it. Keeping them active as much as possible, even if your body has or somebody's body has to support them to do the same activity. That's very, very important as well. And it has to be all together. That's the thing that why all of us here as parents are exhausted. And yes, if somebody has an answer for the sleep issue, please let us know, because like my son, melatonin, sleeping things, nothing helps or has a negative effect. So please let us know if there is any other ideas about sleep.
Does anyone have the answer?
Did you want?
No.
You had mentioned earlier about, the low muscle tone and digestive tract, not being able to move things along. Our daughter has a lot of diarrhea and vomiting, and it goes down whole and it comes back up whole. Is there something that we can use or do to prevent that, to fix it, to maybe get her back on track so that we can get her back, normal, regular, having a harder stool? We can do the diet and everything, but if it's not moving things along properly, it's never gonna get there. Is there a way to fix that?
I'll just ask, maybe I'll actually ask the families here a question, but from your experience, has the tone of your child improved dramatically after the first year of life? Was it really low at birth and then slowly improved, or did any of you feel that your child still has low tone, a few years of life as they did when they were a baby? What was the trajectory overall? It's improving with time? Okay, so that's supportive of, I think, what we've observed. Yeah. Yeah.
My son has been falling.
Yeah.
Still behind, and he didn't.
Okay.
It improves slowly.
Yeah.
It does not become a natural balance.
Yeah, because so that's one thing actually that we need to also, like, I think, discuss, and maybe the one-on-one visits would be appropriate for this as well, because generally speaking, the low muscle tone does improve with time, and that should help with that component of GI dysfunction that can occur. And so usually we see that, and sometimes and the other components of it that are outside of muscle tone would be genuinely that the GI, function is abnormal. Medications in that case would be, necessary or recommended, as Dr. Chung mentioned. And sometimes an evaluation by a gastrointestinal specialist is really key to really understand exactly what's going on, because it could be constipation by itself, it could be diarrhea, it could be mixed. Constipation itself could lead to diarrhea when it's really severe and refractory. So there's not one solution to that, I think. And I'd be happy to go, into a detailed discussion if you'd like. I don't know, Wendy, if you had anything else to add.
Yeah, no, the one other thing just to say is everyone is not going to be exactly the same. And so there are unusual circumstances. I've had patients, for instance, that also need to actually have an endoscopy. I'm not saying for sure that you'll need to, or if you haven't had it already, but sometimes there's eosinophilic esophagitis or other things in terms of food allergies or certain things, celiac disease that absolutely needs to have a gluten-free diet, other things that are complicating that aren't going to, every one of the children isn't going to be the same. So. And I will say, full disclaimer, none of us are gastroenterologists, although we take care of a lot of kids with GI issues.
I'll also make a quick comment about CBD, because I know that also came up during the panel discussion yesterday. So there's now actually an increasing output of research studies that are systematically looking at the efficacy of CBD. And neurologists are really, really interested, of course, and they are the ones who are producing the majority of this research. The most common indication, as you probably all are aware of, is usually intractable epilepsy. It's usually really severe epilepsy, but increasingly CBD is being used for all sorts of developmental disorders. So when you look at studies and data, especially in the US, I'm not sure about the UK actually, I track the literature here more closely, the majority of the studies are focused on those kids who got the treatment because of intractable epilepsy. So we have to take it with a grain of salt when we look at studies that look at CBD use in kids who have other developmental problems. From that group of kids who had intractable epilepsy, the results of CBD use were mixed, meaning that in some kids they helped improve, their seizures, and some kids they were the same, unchanged, and some kids had some side effects due to CBD. So I do think that actually over the next few years we'll be hearing a lot more, there's going to be a lot more data, certainly from the US. So the group actually in Denver, the pediatric neurology group in Denver, is one of the pioneers in the US in terms of the use of CBD systematically in kids with seizures. So I think there's going to be a lot more data coming out over the next few years for CBD use for epilepsy and other developmental problems. So we'll see what that shows.
I just want to make a quick dietary comment on the kids with seizures. So Juhi has generalized myoclonic seizures. And so we recently started the ketogenic diet, or really it's a modified Atkins diet. There's actually really good data for these types of diets in kids with epilepsy, of course, not in our kids. She's tolerating it really well. We got off of one of her seizure medicines, so she's more awake. She seems to be, it's been amazing. So a 90% decrease in her seizures and more interactive, gaining milestones seems to be a little bit faster. I don't know if it's just the diet, but it's a lot of work, but she's tolerated it well. I don't think there's something else with the PPP that's causing problems specific to her with this diet. But for the kids with seizures, I think it's something good to consider. And I'll say that there's studies now going on in adults who don't have seizures, because maybe there's something else going on with. So maybe you guys can comment on that.
I just want to, just a quick comment. One thing we've learned is not to assume that everything going on with Yara is PPP2R5D related. There's normal stuff that kids go through. And we've been through this a few times, and it's like, now we just treat her the same thing, assuming this is just something else, and going after it and finding a solution for it. And most of the things we were able to address. So just because they do something doesn't mean it's because of the variation. It could be just something else. So just from our experience, don't overlook it and try to get to the bottom of it.
Can I just ask, has anyone else had a child with seizures that used the ketogenic diet? Okay. I'm sorry? So a ketogenic diet, so from a very strict point of view, there are certain, especially children with epilepsy, that respond extremely well to having essentially no carbohydrates in their diet. So the ketogenic diet has a huge amount of fat in it, and what it forces the body to do is change fuel sources and to rely on fat and not carbohydrate, and that makes you ketotic. So it can be any types of fat, but for instance, when you do the balance in terms of carbohydrate versus protein versus fat, you're taking out the carbohydrate and you're putting a lot of fat as a substitute. It's a terrible diet in terms of if you're worried about heart disease, so it's not something that we generally recommend for a lot of people. There was a fad in the United States a while back that was called the Atkins diet, that a lot of people tried losing weight with that. I won't talk about that, that's a separate talk, but, and so some people have done, when you're on a really, really strict ketogenic diet, usually your child and you meet with a dietitian that are, telling you very specifically what to do, because people that really need to get on a ketogenic diet, if carbohydrate gets snuck into their diet, it can actually provoke a seizure. But some people will do a modification of that where they'll definitely decrease by a huge amount the carbohydrates and increase the amount of fats. And so there's this sort of modified ketogenic diet. To me, it sounds like an interesting question. We need to keep our eyes on it. I'm not hearing that we've got an answer yet, but it's a good thing to keep our eyes on.
This is not really for you guys. I just want to see, is anybody else on a feeding tube? Yeah. Y'all are? Okay, I'll talk to y'all.
Good morning, my name's Eric. Again, thank you for being here. With the prevalence of genetically modified food, especially, and carbohydrates, especially in the Western Hemisphere and in Europe, would any of you give any consideration to considering that as a cause of genetic mutations in humans, either from a treatment standpoint or further on in a therapy standpoint?
I'll give you my opinion, and other people can certainly weigh in. So I understand the concern in terms of the anything that Monsanto has done to our seeds or anything the cattle industry has done in terms of genetically modified foods in that way. It's actually been very, very carefully done so that those genes can't jump, for instance, from one species to another, either jump from your corn to you or jump from your chickens to you or things like that. So I'm not worried that the source of the new mutations is from the food we're eating in that sense. There's no evidence at all to support that, and the evidence that we have that suggests where this is coming from has nothing to do with that. So I'm not really concerned about that as a potential reason for why there's an outbreak of these conditions or anything like that. I think a more fundamental question is just whether it's genetically modified or not, what the source of the nutritional content essentially of the food is. I don't know if that was your question, but at least that's my opinion.
Yeah, I think the biggest problem with genetically modified food is that instead of modifying the food to make it healthier or better for you, they modify it. One is to increase shelf life, and then probably the most damaging thing is when they actually introduce pesticide resistance to the plant so that they can spray them with higher dose pesticides or herbicide resistance so that you can basically then spray your field with a higher dose of a herbicide that'll kill all the weeds. And that really doesn't help the food at all. But as long as those compounds get out of the food before you eat them, they're not passed on to you. I mean, so the key is to making sure that the companies follow the rules and don't spray the crops too close to taking them to market.